Welcome to another author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today the Poison Pen is honored to have with us author Sara Brunsvold. I hope I got that right.
You did perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you. Whose new book is coming out in January. It's called The Divine Proverb of Streusel. Before we begin today, I'd like to let those tuning in know the Poison Pen does have copies of Sarah's new book on order, and we would be happy to hold one for you or put it in the mail once it's published in January. Just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen bookstore. Now, I'd like to welcome Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me today, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us. My first question usually to authors is, as a reader, I'm fascinated where you got to where you're at, the backstory behind becoming an author. So what can you tell us about Sarah before you became published?
Yeah, so I was one of those people who always dreamed of being a novelist. That started in middle school with my English teacher, who was the first to encourage me to pursue creative writing. And it's all I've ever really wanted to be. Went on to college to get an English degree, with the thought of using that for creative writing, but my bills had other ideas. So I ended up in corporate communications, and I'm still there actually as a day job. I still work specifically in employee communications. Did some short stint at the Federal Reserve as part of my day job career, which was very interesting experience. But it was in 2012 that I, started to get the gray hairs and realizing that, if this dream that I have nurtured in my heart for so many years, if I truly believe that that's the direction I needed to go, then I needed to invest more time and money and effort and discipline into seeing if this is really where I needed to be. And so started attending writers conferences in 2012 and learning the industry, and started to get serious about working on a novel. And it was about exactly 10 years later that my first book was published. So, yeah.
If I understand correctly, part of your journey to publication was finding the right agent, and that's not always easy for an author.
Absolutely, yes. I was just having that conversation with an aspiring author the other day. Finding an agent, especially if you're wanting to be traditionally published through a publishing house, of course, finding a literary agent is that first step because a lot of publishing houses only look at agented authors. And finding the right agent is critical. I mean, they are a business partner in every sense of the word, as well as a coach and encourager. And I learned the hard way. You have to find the agent who understands who you want to be as an author, what your values are, and is willing to come alongside you in that journey and help you learn and grow along the way. And so fortunately, I did, after a long winding path, ended up with my current agent, who is all of those things and more.
That's great. I think it's also kind of a good piece of advice to aspiring writers that you really have to be careful about that, finding the right relationship with your agent.
Absolutely, yes. And it was, I was blessed to have a mentor author, somebody who she's retired at this point, but she had published for many years, has dozens of novels to her credit. And I was blessed to have her as somebody who was essentially looking out for me, as this newbie person who was still learning. And she was the one who kind of taught me that lesson of you got to find the right partner in that. Yeah.
So your first book was published, and it's The Extraordinary Deaths of Mrs. Kipp. And in many ways, it's really a very insightful book. It's a thoughtful book. It's a look at life and death. What can you tell us about your debut novel?
Yeah, so the basic premise of it is a young reporter who begrudgingly takes an assignment to interview an elderly hospice patient. And but it's this unexpected friendship that forms out of her kind of putting her own pride aside and actually listening and getting to know someone of her previous generation. And so I love that book in the sense that I personally enjoy learning the life stories of others, particularly those who have gone before us and who have walked a lot of the experiences that we can relate to. And so and I'm sorry, John, the original question that you were asking about it, could you repeat that for me?
I think I've forgotten it too, but
Oh,
let me, just you've kind of told us a little bit about it. What I got from well, I got many things from the book, but one of the things as a reader was that you were kind of asking us as we each go through life to sometimes think about maybe putting aside what we want in life,
mm.
we think is important for what really, sometimes we want things and they're not really what are important. We have to look at what's the big picture is.
Yes, and I think that's true. You know, both of the characters, the elderly patient, Mrs. Kipp, Clara Kipp, and the young reporter, Aidan Kelly, they both are dreamers. You know, they have certain ideas about how they want their lives to go, and circumstances have kind of forced them to reconsider, you know, what is it that I really want out of life, and what does make the biggest impact. Um, and so toward the end, they kind of grow through that and realize, as you said, you know, what is the most important thing that I want to leave? If I'm building a legacy, if we think of it that way, you know, what is that legacy that I want to leave? And because your legacy will nothing shows what is most important to you like the legacy you're leaving behind. And so, yeah, it's a lot of thoughtfulness through discovering what does that mean to me, the reader.
I also appreciated the way you kind of introduce hospice into the story because many people are not familiar with it until it intrudes in their own life or they have to deal with it in their own way. And it really is a remarkable approach to helping people at the end of their life cycle.
Yes, I 100% agree. You know, hospice is something that my family has walked through a couple of different times. And actually, as I was writing the book, my father-in-law was in hospice care, and it was his nurse that was a subject matter expert for me as I was trying to understand in more depth of just the approach of hospice and the holistic approach that they have to caring for people in their final chapters. And it's just such a moving thing. I know a lot, and I've gotten this reaction from readers is we tend to shy away from, you know, the end of life
Yeah.
stories and, you know, kind of seeing it for just and it can be ugly, right? We can be honest about that. It can be very unpleasant, but there's also a lot of beauty to it.
Mhm.
There's a lot of beauty in the death, which is a line in the book. If we're willing to sit with that ugly part, with the hard parts, that's when we can find the beauty that's hidden within it. And so that was definitely a lesson, an eye-opening thing for me as I was um, researching the book and talking to those who other loved ones who have lost someone or people who work in hospice care and that's one of the resounding things that I heard over and over again is yes, it's hard, but there's a lot of dignity at the end of life stage as well.
That's a wonderful way to phrase it. That brings us to your new book, The Divine Proverb of Streusel. What can you tell us about that book?
Yeah, so kind of borrowing on that concept of being willing to sit with the hard and the ugly in life with the hope of finding the beauty. So the book is about a young woman who is navigating a family crisis by cooking her way through her great-grandmother's German recipes. And it's through this process that she is rediscovering what family means, and the roots that we have, and how do those roots impact the people that we are today in our circumstances today. So it's a lot of fun, and it's loosely based on my own family heritage and story. So it allowed me to mine family history on my side as well, and got to talk to a lot of family members who told me stories I'd never heard, which didn't necessarily make it into the book, but it certainly shaped my own view of where we came from.
When I was reading it and after I'd read it, I really thought for me there were four different words. All start with F, coincidentally, that I thought were important to the book, and that was family, forgiveness, faith, and food. Can you talk a little bit about how those play roles in the story?
Absolutely, yeah, and I love that, the four Fs. Well, let's start with the food. So I feel like food is a universal conduit to understanding culture and understanding the stories around the people within that culture. And so food was just for the main character, Nikki, it's the food that initially drives her in. You know, these recipes that for dishes that she's never heard of, never tasted, but she wants to give it a try. And it's through creating that food that she begins to unpack sort of what's the faith that was packaged together with these recipes. So, to back up a little bit, she finds this notebook that is filled in her late grandmother's belongings, that's filled with German recipes. And each one of those recipes is paired with a proverb or a wise saying, and all of those wise sayings, she quickly discovers, are not only based on faith, but they are based on life experiences. That whoever it was that wrote this notebook clearly had walked through some really difficult things in life, including with family. And again, you know, we can learn from other people's stories and how they navigated things. And so it's the food that initially draws Nikki in, but while she's there, you know, she's learning about the faith and the family struggles that this author has had. And all of that leads her to question, you know, she's being called to forgive within this family crisis, but can she really do that, you know, with the tools that she's been given?
You talked a little bit about the recipes, and I found them fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more about how did you, I mean, are these all family recipes? How did you research them? What I found interesting was we don't realize that recipes from 50 years or more back then, they're not like recipes today. They're not spelled out with every step. You had to kind of, they assumed you knew things.
That is so true. Yes. And the original intent of recipes was just to kind of capture the general idea. But the idea is that you would be cooking alongside your mom or your grandma, you know, and that's how these skills were passed down from generation to generation. You were literally in the kitchen side by side doing it together. So you didn't need to spell out exactly how many teaspoons or all the intricate steps of how to make a Streuselkuchen, for instance, which is a German crumb cake. Um, so, you know, I mentioned that this is sort of loosely based on my own heritage. So I grew up in a area in rural Missouri, rural Northeast Missouri, that was settled by German immigrants in the 1800s. And I'm a descendant, as a lot of people in that area are, of those original immigrants. And but even though I had that German heritage, the German recipes kind of fell by the wayside over the years. So I personally had never eaten a lot of these foods or heard of them myself. So it did take a lot of cookbook searching and Google searching and books, other books, to discover what are even the traditional German foods that would have made it to Middle America in the 1800s. Because the ingredients that you have in Germany are not going to be the same as what you have in Missouri in the 1800s. Um, so what were some of those recipes that a farm wife would have captured in a notebook? And then I had to make those myself, and much to my family's delight. And some of them were much more family friendly than others, I would say. So yeah, a combination of research. I did find a few recipes in my own great grandmother's belongings, and some of those have made it into the book as well. There's a cookie recipe and there's a cabbage recipe that are taken directly from my family collection. Um, but other than that, yeah, it was sort of borrowing from other people and learning what are traditional foods.
That kind of brings me to my next question because I had vaguely kind of knew about this, but your book brought it back to my attention again. One of the reasons we may not know so much about part of our heritage, if you're coming from Germany, is that around the time of World War One, there was a real effort to distance, if you lived in the United States yourself, from Germany.
That's correct. Yes. And that was true even in Middle America. And that certainly happened in my family. So yeah, World War One definitely brought to light for a lot of German immigrants that there were some anti-German sentiment, and rightfully so, among America. Germany was not kind to us at that time period. Um, and so, for instance, in this is captured in the book as well, some of the history there, the Lutheran Church that is central in the story. One of the character points out that if you look at the directory, the listings of baptisms and confirmations and weddings throughout that time period, you'll see names change. They went from the German spelling to the American spelling, and a lot of times they changed the pronunciations of their names as well to be more Americanized. They dropped the language. That was a big change in the area that I grew up in. My grandparents were born in the 1914, so just a little bit before America was drawn into World War One, and their first words were German, and that's all their parents spoke at home. But then, when the war was in full swing, it kind of became dangerous for them to go to town and be speaking German. So they dropped German altogether at home, at school, at church, and English became the language that they knew for the rest of their lives. They never spoke German again. So yeah, it's things like that. And so I do think that there's truth in that, where these recipes that I think in some German families in Missouri, they probably had a longer lifespan and they made it through that time period. But for my family and families where I lived, they kind of stopped, with that, my great grandparents.
One of the other things I appreciated about the book was there's a piece of advice that's repeated throughout, and I'm hoping I'm getting it right. But one of the characters tells Nikki, just do the next thing when you're in
Yeah.
a difficult situation. Can you kind of expand about what that means?
hmm Yeah, and do the next thing is it actually originated from a poem back in the 1800s. I think it was published in the 1800s. It was popularized in the 1980s by Elizabeth Elliot, who was a missionary, and and I kind of think of the way that she framed it when she was sharing the story. Is sometimes our situations, our circumstances can be so overwhelming. There's just it's just like this gray cloud is around us, and we can't see very far in front of us. But we do have control over the next thing that we do, and we have that choice always to, what is the next step that I want to take? And if I'm choosing to, hopefully we're choosing to take that in a positive direction. So, and I think that's also true with writing a book too. It's good advice for writing a book. It's don't worry about, all 50 pages that you have to go. Just worry about the next sentence, worry about the next paragraph. Just do the next thing.
Hmm, that's terrific because I was going to ask you about your writing process, and you kind of led into that. You've now completed two books. Does it get easier after writing the first book? Does the next book become easier, or is it just a different challenge for you?
Yeah, it seems like it's more of a different challenge. And one thing that I learned is that going from book one to book two is a significant jump. It's because for the first time you're writing to expectations, and you have readership now that, and you have a publisher who is expecting certain things, and you don't necessarily have that with book one. As you're writing that book one, you have more freedom, but now you're writing a deadline, and so there's just more pressure, I would say, with book number two, and more expectations that you're writing under. So that can be a significant learning curve. But I think that's the biggest hurdle, I'm told, by authors who are much farther along than I am, that going from book one to book two is the biggest jump. But then from then on out, I don't know if it gets easier, but it's just you know more what to expect. And I've learned, as I'm writing book number three right now, I'm learning that it's okay for that first draft to just not be worthy of the light of day, because you always have the chance to go back and edit, and you have people on your team that will help you develop that book to the final polished version.
As a writer, do you find yourself when you're approaching a new project, do you like to know lots of things in advance? Do you just have a germ of an idea and think, I'm going to go with that? I know writers are all over the place when it comes to that. Kind of what is your route to starting a book?
I tend to think of the premise first, just have that germ of an idea. And then I write character-driven stories, so I dive deep into the characters after that. Once I have the seed of an idea, I want to know who the characters are. What are their goals, their motivations, what is preventing them from getting to their goals, and really developing out who they are, their personalities, and then that informs how the plot is going to go, based on what they're trying to do and what's conflicting with that. That's when I start to plot out the points. But I do it in a fairly loose way, because I also like, I structure is good, and I enjoy structure, but I also like the freedom to discover and let the characters go in a different direction if they want to. So I'm a bit of a mix of what they call the plotter and the writing by the seat of your pants, the pantser. So, but that's generally how I approach it.
I think you're also kind of inspirational to aspiring writers because you have a day job. So you need to find time to work on your other passion, which is writing. I mean, is it something that you actively set aside a certain time of day, or does it just vary as your life schedule varies? Can you talk a little bit about the challenges in juggling two different careers, I guess we'll say it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of authors who are in this position as well. I am fortunate to work part-time for my day job, so that certainly helps. But yes, I do structure my week, and I can't, at this point in my life, I can only do it at a week view rather than a month out or so. So week by week, just depending on my schedule. I also have children in the home, so a lot of it depends on their schedule as well. But I have learned to be very intentional and receptive to those pockets of time when I can sneak away into my writing desk and put some words on the page. But I also make an effort, with my husband's support, to block out weekends or block out nights where I can do a writing retreat, Or I can one night a week, he takes care of dinner and I go to the library and I have, 3, 4 hours of uninterrupted time. But it's all about finding the rhythm within your family schedule, within your home schedule, but always making it a priority to get that writing time in.
That's a good message to give. Let's shift direction a little bit because I have a quote from your new book that I thought was really wonderful, and it kind of plays into the question I have for you. The quote you had put was, "The books someone chooses to keep tell you a lot about their character." What books would we find on your shelf, and what would they tell us about Sarah?
A lot of the books that you will find on my shelf, they tend to be about real people or based on real people. Again, I value life stories. So you'll find biographies, you will find historical fiction, you will find a lot of contemporary fiction. They're all books that have a note of hope in them in some way. Whether that's, a faith-based author like I am, or if it's somebody that I'm a huge fan of, Friedrich Bachmann. And he writes some really hard things, but there's always that thread of hope at the end. And so I gravitate toward storytellers who can tell a really good story, but tell it in a realistic way. And I don't like sugarcoating things. So I like authors who boldly discuss real issues of the human condition or the human experience, but always point the reader to hope.
Have there been anything recently that you've read that you'd want to suggest to other readers?
Well, actually, what I'm reading right now is The Long March Home by Tosca Lee and Marcus Brotherton, which I believe you had on the podcast
Mhm.
a few months ago.
Yeah.
And I highly, highly recommend that book. I haven't quite finished it yet, but it's a World War II novel set in the Pacific Theater, and um, incredible writing, very realistic battle scenes, and but again, it's about those three childhood friends who are trying to navigate this horrific situation that they're in and find their way home.
You mentioned something about faith-based fiction, inspirational fiction. I know that if you're not familiar with this particular type of book or story, there's a lot of misperceptions. You can somehow think you know what it is, but you really don't. For someone who's never read in that particular, we'll call it genre, what would you like to tell them about it?
Mhm. So I would say faith-based fiction it's a fiction story, but it's told through the lens of a particular worldview. So in my case, I write fiction stories, but told through a Christian worldview. So it's kind of looking at the world as it really is, but how do we reconcile the world as it really is with the faith that we have, that we use as a lens to try to understand it. So I hope that helps.
Mhm.
I know there's it's not just Christian. It's there's other faith based writers who write from different worldviews, but generally that's how I understand it and describe it.
I think it's also important if you haven't read or not familiar with it, there isn't one faith-based type of fiction, just as there isn't one type of romance novel or one type of mystery novel. I mean, you may read a particular faith-based fiction book and think, I don't like that, but it's just, you may not like that particular book. There's other books out there.
True, and I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but there's contemporary, there's sci-fi, there's like all the different, there's mysteries, there's all different types of books within that category.
Yeah. So don't always judge a genre by one book, I guess is the message
Yes.
we'd want to give. You mentioned a little bit about you're working on another project. Is there anything you would like to tell us or can tell us about what's next?
Yeah, so working on book number three, and at this point, what I can say is that it is about a mom and her grown daughters who go on a bookish road trip around the Midwest. So visiting different sites relate that were either settings for a particular book or they were the hometowns of a particular author. So very, very exciting, and I've had a chance to visit some of these places, and they're some of them are pretty neat.
That sounds terrific. Are some of the books favorites of your own that you include?
Well, so I'm in Kansas City, so Nebraska is not too far from me, and Willa Cather's
That's good.
books.
Yeah.
I really enjoy Willa Cather. I grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, which is famous for Mark Twain, and so I've always got a sentimental spot for Mark Twain's work.
Before we run out of time, and I can't believe how quickly it's gone by, how can readers learn more about you and your books? Are you on social media?
I am, yes, and I'd be glad to find them as well. So at sarabrunsvold.com, and then I am primarily on Instagram and Facebook, and would love to see you there.
I think at one point you'd written to someone else or talked to someone else about we never quite sometimes understand how important the connection is between an author and a reader. And sometimes as a reader, you think, oh, they don't care, why is this person going to be interested? But it can really be a powerful connection point for an author.
I'm so glad you said that. It is 100% true. Those reader emails or DMs, you just never know what kind of day the author is having. And so to get that word of encouragement or to get just a quick line of what that story meant to you, it can really make an author's day. It's probably, to me, it's even as exciting as a royalty check. So it means the world to know that what we've labored over it means something to a reader.
Is finding an audience. That's great. It's been a wonderful quick tour through Sara Brunsvold's books and her life. I want to thank Sara for taking time to be with us. Her new book, The Divine Proverb of Streusel, will be here soon, next January. It's not too early to pre-order through your favorite independent bookstore or ask your library to purchase a copy if you're a library reader. I want to thank Sara for joining us today and for all of you tuning in to another author chat. We look forward to seeing you virtually next time.